Uh, Hi, I'm Oana Stanescu. I'm a Romanian architect with a design practice in New York. I knew I didn't want to be an engineer like my dad. Well, I like technical drawings actually a lot, but I knew I didn't want to work in a factory. And I loved numbers, which my mom was dealing with as an accountant or an economist, but I knew I didn't want to be stuck in an office. And I had a friend going to architecture school, and he said you should try. And first I was like, me, no. I mean, I didn't have any kind of, let's say, artistic background. But then I kind of talked to some people, tried some things, took some classes, and the professor said actually if you wanted, you could probably make it. But all of this to say that I think partially why I ended up going was because I wasn't sure what it meant to be an architect. I wasn't sure how an architect would spend his day. And to me, that was compelling. As a lawyer, as a doctor, with a very superficial understanding, I could imagine what they do. But with an architect, I had no architects in the family or anything like it. And so it was, if anything, intrigue and curiosity, and something that seemed impossibly weird and complicated, and I wouldn't know where to even start with it. And I studied in Romania in actually a university town that's one of the largest after Bucharest, basically. But it's a really good. It was always it was public school. It was always known as a very tough and good architecture school. Usually, the choices in Romania would be, at least at the time, because the world wasn't quite as open as it's now. We weren't part of the European Union now, so things depend heavily on that. You have the option to go between Bucharest and Timișoara in the western part of the country. And I was close to that, and not so much because it was familiar territory. I was already traveling quite a lot, but more so because it was a good and considered a really tough school. By now, all of us, and especially all the kind of coming generations, everyone travels so much and lives in so many places. It's a bit unsettling almost. Um, there's many places where I feel comfortable in, or even at home. I will say most of the time it has to do with the person than the place itself. There's probably one single place where the place has the meaning of home for me, and that's a tiny village in the middle of nowhere in Romania. And that's because that used to be kind of our weekend retreat, or whatever you want to call it. It was a house in a deserted village my parents got in the 90s, and a lot of my childhood and as I was growing up, a lot of time we spent there being just young and free. And it's pretty much, it's in the mountains, and it's just that's the one place where I probably sleep best. But that place changes too, and then we change. So I think outside of that, it's really rather people that give me the feeling of a home than physical places. I wasn't looking for it consciously, for sure. I came to New York by mistake. It never crossed my mind to go to New York. I had never been to New York at the time. And actually, I lived on quite a few continents. I lived in South Africa for a while. I lived in Japan briefly, and lived in Europe and Switzerland. So I gypsied around quite a bit. And New York was the first big city where I lived in, but I hadn't visited before I came there. So I landed on Saturday. On Monday, I started my job. It was nice in a way because I never had the time to build up expectations or to imagine too much. It just kind of happened. But I will say, what was with New York, and I think that happens with a lot of people, it felt strangely familiar, although I'd never been to the States and or in any kind of comparable large city. And I'm not sure quite why it was so familiar. I'm going to presume it's because of music and movies and kind of the kind of cultural things that you ingest unconsciously. It didn't feel like a foreign or strange thing. It felt, I've seen some of this. It's hard to describe. Yeah, so I kind of just came upon it. But it's a love-hate relationship for sure. For sure, I had both mentors and, well, people who supported me or enabled me to get places, for sure. And especially as you get older, you appreciate that more and more. And maybe their roles have also changed with time. My first mentors were probably the professors in the school that were able to kind of shield me from some of the ways of a school, and kind of just just give me the wings that I needed in order to just kind of start believing in myself, or in order to even just start pushing the ideas. I think maybe that's what it was. People who I felt were kind of pushing me from behind and kind of just making me do things and pursue ideas. And that's what it was in the beginning. And then with time, in a way, the role of the people who are there to support you changes in nature. But I always felt, and I sometimes think about it, I always feel there's a couple of people who, you know, whether they put your name up for something, or you don't know how these things always work or when that happens, but I oftentimes think that we all kind of depend on each other in that sense ultimately, and it's a very nice feeling. It's not people that I necessarily spend a lot of time with or talk about these things, but you sometimes do feel supported from places where you don't necessarily expect it, and it's really an amazing feeling, and it's something incredible. But I learned, you know, especially getting older too, I definitely learned to appreciate relationships and invest in them more. And take the time to invest in friendships and relationships like that. And there is always, I feel, I'm saying friendships because the mentoring kind of suggests a certain dimension, a certain hierarchy to that relationship. But I feel I learn a lot in friendships, and from most of my friends, whatever level they are in their careers, I still keep on learning on a regular basis, and I'm inspired on a regular basis. And I find that incredibly powerful because that happens in the most casual of ways, right? It's over breakfast or over a random conversation when you least expect it. Because sometimes those people who you admire and respect are the ones who are able to kind of touch you at the deepest and know you best too. I can't think of anyone specifically right now, and I think it would be unnecessary in a way, because if you mention someone, you don't mention many other ones. And in my particular case, I do think of it rather as of a collective of people that at certain times in certain circumstances just believed in me, and that was hugely important, and I always felt they believed in me more than I dared to believe in myself at the time. I mean, it's maybe a bit unfair, and but maybe, I mean, unfair because I said I wouldn't name anyone, but my first year at Rex, when I first came to New York and, you know, I was working at OMA/Rex, that was a mind-blowing year. Of course, you're in New York, you work in this high-profile office on crazy projects. But it wasn't just that. When I left, I told Erez Ella and Joshua Prince Ramus, my two bosses, that the biggest change that year meant for me, it was definitely one of those pivotal moments in my life, where a lot of other moments you don't quite sure, it takes time for them to kind of generate into something. But there was a moment where you kind of know, okay, something dramatic has happened. And I told them that actually the biggest thing they gave to me wasn't just the experience, but was really kind of it's funny because in retrospect it's one of those American things almost, but it was something along the lines that if you believe in your own ideas, you can pursue them, and it's almost like a responsibility to do so. So just this kind of, again, kind of giving one wings. They definitely gave me more responsibility and believed more in me than I would have ever dared to, for sure. And not one time, but over and over and over again. So they kind of, I think they taught me to walk, maybe, in that sense, right? In order for me to eventually, hopefully, learn to run. For sure, my first major steps were thanks to them, 100%. I always say I kind of stop making plans, or I don't make plans, because everything that happened to me, quote unquote, happened, is better than I would have dared to plan for. And I think that's been consistently true, and I think that's something that I always still try to keep as a way forward. Not to just box things in, but rather kind of keep them open for things that you can't believe are possible, essentially. I studied in Romania. I then did a brief scholarship in Sevilla in Spain. From there, I went to New York for a year. Then back to Romania, did my thesis. Then went to Japan. Then went to South Africa. Then went to Switzerland. Then went back to New York. And in each of these places, I was working. It was, after Rex, I basically was trying to find the place that I was interested in. And pair it with an office that I was interested in. Prior to that, I traveled quite a bit in Europe, but not outside of Europe. So kind of I realized, I mentioned I started studying architecture because I didn't know what it meant. So I realized that freedom was actually a lot more potent than I would have ever dared to hope. Because a lot of offices do international work, they hire you based on your work in your portfolio. Which is very liberating, right? Very removed from the whole kind of bureaucracy that we're too familiar with quite often. So I worked in all these places, which were amazing. For a while, my kind of mantra was not to stay longer than 1 year in a place, because it was my way of getting to know places and offices. But I knew I also didn't have a good reason to stop anywhere, so I was kind of just gypsying around until something was to happen. And then I moved back to New York and eventually started an office with a colleague, Dong, who I had met at Rex, and we were still doing competitions these entire years while I was traveling. And then definitely the office became a little bit more, or I stopped traveling as much as I would have, and I realized that after the first years, because it's hard to run an office and to put it on its feet, I realized after a few years of kind of American office, like trying to build an office in America, that I was kind of subsumed to the American work ethics. I was like, I need to travel more. But I feel too, even so, you still end up traveling. Well, if before I was living when moving from place to place once a year, I think then in the last 10 years, I definitely started taking too many plane rides on like a weekly basis or something like that. So it's short trips, work trips all over the world. Which I also, in the beginning, it's a lot of fun, but then with time, you're kind of, now I'm happy when I don't have to get on a plane actually and have a few days in a place. I kind of really cherish that. My inspiration always comes outside of the architecture field. And because I always was always displaced, and kind of always an outsider wherever I'd end up, my immediate circle of friends is rarely ever architects, actually, funnily enough. It's only half true, actually. Is it hard being a young architect in America? I think it's hard being a young architect everywhere, but I think it's also exciting and kind of awesome. I will say, as hard as it could be here, it is still very much a place that offers you opportunity that I'm kind of questioning whether they're possible in other places. And I am actually extremely grateful and well aware that a lot of the things that happen to me or that I get to do here wouldn't have been as possible anywhere else. And I think that's something that I learned to appreciate and I think about a lot, especially juxtaposing it with Europe. Because it's what America stands for still. There's not the innate traditionalism that is in Europe, but also the innate kind of hierarchy between roles and people. So I think that's why you have a lot of oftentimes quote unquote crazy things or exceptions to the rule happening in the US. So I tend to always look at what's the bright side and what are the opportunities that come with that. And I feel too, because we're in a time where technology plays such a big role in our lives, that does also open a lot of opportunities again here, because America is at the forefront from that perspective in terms of not only generating these technological revolutions, but also running with them and kind of advancing in ways where other places are a lot slower. And it goes both ways. There's positives and negatives, but I think there's still a vibrancy to the things that happen here that is good and that makes room for a lot of opportunities. So I think in many ways it's hard to be a young architect everywhere today, or it's hard to be young everywhere today. I mean, particularly is this. I don't think it's just an architect thing. I think the young generation has this, for good reason, this anxiety. It's interesting, right? If I think back of over 10 years ago when I graduated, it was a very different world. And with regards to people knowing what architects do, probably many don't quite know where to put it, or they don't quite know what exactly to make of it. But in the same time, I also don't really know what, I don't know, a brain surgeon does, right? I oftentimes think about it because I think as architects, we oftentimes think, oh, the people aren't interested in architecture. That's true, but how interested are we in farming, for example, or how interested are we in doctors? And do we deserve more attention than other people? But that's partially because I feel there's a lot of beating up in the architecture world, and it's always poor us because we're at the mercy of clients and so on and so forth. And I feel you can only assume that position for so long. At one point you have to either make something of it or kind of get yourself out of it, because otherwise you kind of generally start believing it. I do think people are interested in architecture though. I think people want to know more about it. I think people want to have a bigger say in it too. And I do think it's our job as architects to facilitate that conversation and to run the conversation. I think kind of staying in isolated academic circles is not very productive. In the big picture, or in terms of kind of opening the field to allowing people to participate actively in it. I think we have a huge responsibility in that sense. And it's interesting, I'm really curious how things are going to change now with this kind of new pace of the world and with these kind of dramatic cultural shifts, how that will affect the whole kind of educational, cultural world too, and professional. All of this to say that I think there's dramatic changes happening, which I find exciting. It can be terrifying, of course, because it means you don't quite know where things are going. But ultimately, change is always good and for the better. And I mean, change is permanent or constant too. I think it just kind of comes to a head. It's much needed. It's necessary, right? We're running this thing into the ground, so it's hard to tell what would have happened if or how. So I can only kind of take what happened and appreciate that, or kind of speak to that. But I am oftentimes wondering, I mean, Europe can be a lot just more traditional in that sense, and way more hierarchical, and you have that a lot in schools too, way more ingrained and less willing to take chances and less willing to progress, right? The foundations in a way are deeper, and therefore there's less room for there's less desire for experimentation, because there's fear not to kind of derail or lose what was. Or there's a really beautiful James Baldwin quote, but I would massacre it, so I can't actually read it, but he compares very much Europe with the US, and he says something along the lines that I can't remember what he says about the US needing to learn from Europe. Oh, that's what it was. He says what people have in Europe is a sense of tragedy, a sense that life is hard, and that's something that Americans could benefit of learning from. But in the same time, Europe could benefit some of the kind of air of audacious optimism that permeates in the US. I don't know that optimism would best describe what's happening in the US today, but I think there's something to that. There's like a blatant kind of push forward that's happening here. But there is, of course, a lot of richness, and I think a deeper appreciation for architecture, for sure, in Europe. Because I feel I always was an outsider and I didn't study here. I met people in offices, and of course, I wasn't familiar with the kind of academic world and how insular that can be. So that means my first years, I come from practice, and of course you have architects in the office, but outside of that, your constant communication is with clients, with people from other worlds, and with people who you want to ultimately work with, whether they're friends and become clients or just potential collaborators. So I was never that interested in the kind of insular conversation within the architecture world, because you all know the same things, talk about the same things. So in a way, I feel there's a lot more to learn from people who see things differently. And that this isn't a diss against anything. It's just kind of because I've been teaching on the side in the last years, I've been exposed to these different worlds, parallel worlds now. So for me, the natural way of the world was very much to just pursue your interests and pursue kind of the people you're interested in collaborating with, and then just kind of see what happens from there. I do think that is maybe something that's also less, I'm not sure. To me, it happened here, but if you live in New York, you can run into anyone on the street. You can run into anyone in any of these schools. You can run into anyone in a bar, in a hotel, in a restaurant. So that's really exciting. It can be misleading at times too, but I do think that opens a lot of gates. And I was always interested rather in the conversation. I think I end up seeing architecture just as an excuse ultimately, and an excuse to spend time with people, to learn from people, to exchange ideas, and that's what I'm trying to do actually ultimately, right? To just kind of be more thoughtful with how do I want to spend my hours of the day. Well, we're on a Saturday, so it's weekend. And we're in a hotel room in LA, which is not where I live. And I'm here because I'm giving a lecture on Monday, and I was trying all day to kind of finish some of the lecture, but it's seemingly impossible to do it more than 24 hours before. I went with some friends to see an amazing building for a potential project, and that was really exciting, really beautiful, old school, like almost 100-year-old building now, for a potential project, which if that happens, that would be pretty mind-blowing. So that's always exciting because it's a great way to start the day too. But it gives you it gets your mind going, of course, and it lets you dream a little bit. I'm always very cautious in the beginning because in architecture, just a conversation to get to a project can be rather long, and knowing that it's such a complex, it's at the intersection, it's such a complex thing, it's at the intersection of so many things that I don't believe it till I see it. So I'll be ready when we get there, but it's still exciting to just see beautiful spaces actually. Just that alone, and the kind of conversation with the friends were really exciting. So I think that's what occupied the majority of the day, and then it rained and there was hail, and it doesn't make any sense because I come to avoid cold New York, and then you get ice balls falling from the sky in LA. But I was enjoying the view from the hotel room as I was, working and moving things around, just because you see both the sky and this strange facade here with dog faces for some reason. And LA is always fascinating to me. I'm actually happy to be back because it's just culturally such a specific and such a strange place. And I always find this refreshing, being in a place that's outside of that takes you out of your everyday, that takes you out of your familiar. I think there's nothing that kind of gets your brain going. I'm always more productive on the road than when I'm at home or in the office at times. Of course, when you're in the office, you get to draw and you can kind of go in your cave. But there is something that I feel when you're on the road is just incredibly stimulating that you can't compare to anything else. Which isn't just the architecture, right? It's everything else. It's how we inhabit spaces, how we move, what dog faces we put on buildings. Also accident. I have a lot of good accidents because I never taught here. I wasn't even sure what that would imply, or again, I didn't even think as far. First I taught with Michael Rock from 2x4. He asked me to teach with him a class called Graphic Narratives at Columbia. So there was a seminar years ago, and I was still very unbaked, but it was, I really am thankful. And if you speak of mentors, I'm really thankful for that opportunity. It was my first sort of introduction at American schools, and then you start going to reviews, and then I think it was 3 or 4 years back, Meejan from MIT had reached out and asked me if I wanted to teach a studio. And my first thought was, are you sure? And my second thought, and again, this is what I mean with people giving you chances, because more often than not, when moments like that happen, my first question is always, are you sure? Meaning, I don't know if I would have dared to think about it otherwise. But I was very thankful for that, because it was a great semester, first semester at MIT in grad school, coordinated by Liam O'Brien, and it was really great. And all of a sudden I was realizing that it's a lot of fun, that somehow it was giving me energy. By then we already had a practice for quite a few years, and it became, I think, to a certain degree, I would go to school and we'd do crazy things, and I go back in the office and I'm like, why aren't we doing crazy things here? And I think the dynamic in that sense, it was very inspiring, right? You definitely did get a breath of fresh air. I feel I learn a lot in teaching, because you have to constantly have conversations. Basically, again, you're just having conversations with some peers, and the only difference between you and students is just the experience. And the experience can be a negative thing too, right? Because you start going like a train on your train tracks. And those conversations are always very useful. You're also forced to explain things and forced to second guess yourself. Well, a lot of the things that we do are so intuitive or so internalized that we don't have to put them into words. But I find this exercise of having to try to explain or understand even what you do, or kind of think about, it forces you to think through ideas a lot deeper, and I found that very productive. And so I've been teaching since, I try to do it only one semester a year or something like that, because I find there's nothing as exhausting in a good way. But at the end of a day of teaching, I always feel you feel physically, emotionally, and intellectually drained. Somehow every single kind of chamber of energy in your body has been sucked out. But still, I find that in a way weirdly, perversely energizing. And I still feel, teaching studio to me is like being in the practice and doing projects. I always find that a lot of fun, and all the time I can't believe I'm getting paid for this, because there's a beauty, and you're just kind of playing around when it's at its best, right? With these amazing young bright minds, and that's just a lot of fun and super inspiring. So I like the duality between that and the practice. It's a nice kind of parallel, or of course they kind of intersect or go in and out, but I enjoy the kind of duplicity of those. I'm teaching Core 4 at Harvard GSD, Graduate School of Design. Core 4 is the fourth semester in grad school, and it's housing. So we do have a common brief and have 10 students, and then you're meant to assume a position as a studio. And the position we're assuming is post-work. I actually called it post-work. Can't sing it. But the idea was, the notion of work doesn't quite work anymore. Almost half of the households, both here and in Europe, that are in poverty are working households. And around half of the graduates of school work in positions that they're overqualified for. So with that in mind, there's this theory of post-work, of a world in which work won't be at the center of your lives anymore. I think if you read into that, it's kind of unsustainable. The workforce becomes unsustainable because slowly a large majority of the population's ability to work is being replaced by AI and robots. And in a way, I find that not a sad thing. I think that's a good thing. Ultimately, aren't we doing all these things just so we don't have to work as much? So we're exploring post-work and kind of studying what does that do to housing ultimately. If you don't live somewhere because it's close to your office or because it's close to the work that you do, where do you live then? And how do you live? Who do you live with? You know, the nuclear family itself, only about half of the American households are the typical kind of nuclear family, even today. The nuclear family is deeply shaped by how we work. And the notion of the home too, and again with work home changing, with the notion of the work changing. How does the family work? Who do you live with? How do you live with? Those are the questions that we're looking at. And in addition to that, I'm teaching a seminar that's called Non-Professional Practice. It's all about avoiding work if you think about it. But in a good way. It's funny too, because of course, especially in a place like GSD, but we're all workhorses and we all work, day and night. But the notion isn't so much about not working, the same with non-professional, but not doing it purely for economical points of reason. So really being rather free to pursue your own interests, rather than doing exclusively in order for subsistence, basically. And so non-professional practice is a seminar in which we're trying to explore alternative modes of practices. We're looking at people from different creative fields, and we're having a lot of conversations and also doing some research with regards to what the opportunities are, what the possibilities are with the skill sets that we have as architects to lead a fulfilled professional life. And of course, a lot of people ask, what is non-professional? Does it stand against professional? And if anything, I think it's, there's not an easy line that can be drawn, but it's really an attitude more than anything else. So it's more the eyes with which you look at your work. So it's more a matter of perspective, and you're kind of thinking around that. So that's something also that is completely in line with what I do in general and what I try to do, or how I look at the world. So to me, they're really just extensions of conversations and kind of a platform in which I'm able to kind of extend this conversation to a larger audience. And it's exciting. I recently was invited to speak at the Berlage Institute on this topic because it's something on everyone's mind. But I think it's also impossible or very hard to tackle because it's a completely shifting territory. So you can't really formalize something that is completely informal at the end of the day. But yeah, it's something fascinating, and I'm hoping to kind of push a little bit further. I'm curious on that note, do doctors ever tell themselves, I'm not doctor enough? Is this just an architect thing? Because this notion of, but it's not architecture, or I'm doing whatever, but it's not architecture, is that really, or is anyone else doing that, or is that just us? Because I never quite understand. And I think, again, it's a matter of perspective. And I think this is where, to me, the myth of what the architect is, it's like in the Matrix, it's the dude, which is, of course, old dude, white hair, white suit, at the center of the universe. That's not going to happen again. The kind of the way we think of the Michelangelos or Corbusiers or Mies, and of course we love them, but I think that myth is so deep ingrained in our skin that we can't see past it. I think the skill set that we have as a profession and the kind of education that comes with it is amazing and super useful in this kind of super hyper, more and more complex world that's kind of speeding up more and more. I feel the only thing that is in our way is ourselves more than anything. Like these myths, they're like we're just tripping over, I think, what an architect is meant to be doing or used to be doing or should be doing. When I find the whole beauty of architecture is that it's not defined, that it tackles on a lot of things, right? You're a journalist, you're not great at one thing, you're kind of okay at many things. So the freedom that comes with that is, to me, the single most exciting thing about what we do. And then, but this kind of question of, but is it architecture? What I do is not architecture. It's so common. And everyone's just kind of beating themselves up. Who else does that? I'm really curious. I hope it never feels like I stop learning, because I still feel the most exciting thing is just discovering, ideas, discovering new perspectives. Invariably, you're evolving as a person. So I'm fundamentally allergic to sitting still or becoming too comfortable. I think because I can be very good at getting comfortable. So I'm hoping I'm always learning and kind of just pushing things forward. But back to the notion of no plans, I think I still very much operate in that world. And in a way, I'm trying to operate more and more too. Is I think one thing that is crucial to me is to kind of disentangle myself from the world around, or the kind of from an economic point of aspect, meaning I'm just kind of pursuing a position of creative freedom. I think that's at the essence of what I'm trying to do, because the moment you lose that, you kind of don't really have any room to play with anymore, right? So I think that's one thing that I'm pursuing heavily. And in terms of learning, I mean, I feel the more I know, the less I know. So there's always more and more to be learned in a way, right? And then you realize actually there's less and less to be known. So so that's that. And with regards to probably one of the hardest thing I can tell you, one of the hardest things that I've done and that benefited my work was not work. You see a common theme here. It was something I was forced into, but it happened 3 years ago. When I say forced into, it was a health issue. So I kind of, I had a surgery, and then I took time off. I could have gone back to work, but I took time off and decided for a few months to just stay in the woods, in that place that I called home earlier. And just read and cook and not do anything work. And it's hard because we live in a day of FOMO, right? Our biggest fear is not missing out on all these amazing things that are happening on Instagram more than anywhere else. And weirdly, it's hard because, the emails stop trickling in and you don't hear from people anymore. And the world continues to revolve. So in a way, it can be terrifying. So I had to absolutely do it. Otherwise, I think it wouldn't have been possible. But I will say in that period, it's a luxury, and we never have that luxury as adults. We take 2 weeks off and we can barely find our brains again. But for me, I realized in that period, it was the first time in probably a decade, probably since in high school, where I felt I have a brain again and I have space in my head to just enjoy things, take things in, and look around the world with new eyes. Like, it's almost I had felt I had time to digest what I was interested in, what had happened in, the kind of 15 years almost of working and studying. And because it was nonstop architecture back to back to back, right? From school all the way to then. And it was always intense jobs, and then always the next thing, and always the next thing. And you can never quite stop, because how can you stop in 2020, even for a second? And I wasn't quite sure at the time what the benefits of that experience were, but I know they were meaningful. I just couldn't put my hand into any and kind of say it's this what I'm getting out of it. And funnily enough, I think now years after, I realized actually how fundamental that some of the shifts that happened then were. And now they're kind of coming up or kind of growing, materializing themselves in different ways. But I don't think they could have happened without that perspective. And it made me also realize the kind of strange lives we live, and the way we're always on the wheel. But that's misleading, because you sometimes forget, what kind of wheel you're on, and how does it actually look from the outside, and is that something you want to do or not? So that was probably definitely the hardest thing I had to do. I think everything else. Maybe the second thing that's hard is I felt I never necessarily wanted an office for myself. At one point, you just get tired of working for other people. And the hardest thing that was to learn in having a practice, and that's a conversation that I'm having a lot with people, is actually learning to keep your cool, or your kind of sanity, in the face of a constant shifting territory. Once you have a practice, once you're on your own, once you're not relying on a fixed salary, once you don't get a paycheck on a monthly basis, you're always in shifting grounds, right? It's kind of like surfing or snowboarding. I don't surf, but that's how I imagine surfing. That's why I don't surf, actually. But you're kind of, things are always changing, whether it's a project coming or going, or people, or there's always something happening. And kind of trying to keep your balance on this shifting ground was the hardest part. And that took a couple of good years of kind of learning to not get not let all of that get to you, and just kind of understand, okay, that is work, that is important, but it's dangerous because it can easily permeate in any 24, in any kind of second of the 24 hours that you have a day. And there was a huge learning curve, and I think it's crucial now because I feel the world is on a shifting territory. They say the skill set that you're learning in school now is going to be oblivious to you at least by the time you're 40. And truthfully, I mean, some of the softwares that even I was using at the time don't even exist anymore, let alone other things. So I think the world is on a shifting territory, and I see the need that a lot of the young people have for answers. But I also think it's crucial to understand that no one can give you those answers, and kind of make that shift from kind of here's the path, good luck, to kind of making your own path, to kind of understanding that a lot of it lies in your own hands more than anything else, and it's your job to kind of question that path, and that's hard, but it's all about, I think, learning to come to terms. To me, what it means is just knowing yourself really well. Like, how averse are you to risk? How much can you take on or not? I don't think running a practice is for everyone. I don't think everyone should be freelancing or whatever. It's not necessarily easy, or nothing is for everyone, right? Like, I think everyone just has to figure out what they're interested in. And funnily enough, I think that's a hard question in architecture, because we kind of are misleadingly trained to believe that architecture is one thing, when it's not. There's not two offices that you're going to work in where your day is going to be spent the same way. There's not two architects who spend their day the same way. So that's why the most crucial question is kind of finding your own spot within that, and just coming to terms with the shifting territory. I came to see music not that removed from architecture, not that removed from what I read, not that removed from friendships, because ultimately everything reflects the same value, so everything kind of comes together. And it's also something that for a long time I wasn't quite sure how these different kind of parts of me were speaking to each other. And then by working with some of these people, they kind of come together. I'm always incredibly grateful, and it's interesting because I think both Virgil and Kanye also always saw themselves as outsiders. So I think that there's a kind of common language. There's just a certain perspective to the world when you come from that mindset, because you don't expect to be invited to the party in a way. I think you're kind of used to just kind of make your own party. Maybe potentially terrible analogy. But one thing that I thought about a lot is, because Kanye comes from the music industry, which is not as, the rules of that game, where they can be very painful, they're very different than architecture. In architecture, you have to earn your stripes, and again, you have to fit in a certain cookie cutter. But he didn't care that I was young or a woman, and I felt very supported by him early on, and he, allowing me to work on such amazing projects, inviting me to work on such amazing projects, and kind of being interested in the conversation, which was very refreshing, which again, I can't see happening in a traditional architectural world. And that's because his perspective from a different industry, there wasn't even a question. And I'm always going to be incredibly grateful for that. And I always think back of that, where again, just because we tend to live in our bubbles, and we all have our bubbles, we forget how the rest of the world operates. And that's dangerous from many points of view. We can see that politically today, but it also means you're just kind of repeating things as opposed to kind of allowing things to lead to different things. And then Virgil was part of the same world, and you're going to consider him a dear friend, and working with him was always just incredibly fun. And it's been amazing with him too, to be there from the beginning and to kind of see him grow. To me, it's also always fascinating to see how the world around one changes with that. But there's again a bit of an outsider's perspective, and a pursuit of freedom, and pursuit of creative ideas, of having to kind of break down certain walls, certain boxes, and then of course working with someone like that. In both cases, the outreach, it's funny, right? Because as an architect, the conversations happen on the phone or at the table. It's 2 people, 5 people in a room. but then the repercussions of some of those things can be global, which is a strange thing to say. And I remember actually at Madison Square Garden when Yeezus opened, I mean, I saw that show probably 10 times, and it was a collaborative project. We had one role, but Vanessa Beecroft did amazing work on it and was able to bring it to fruition. And, you know, as Devlin and Virgil and so many people were involved in that. But still, being part of that conversation and then being in Madison Square Garden, which, I don't know, 20,000 people or something like that, react to something that you are a part of, you don't really get that in architecture. So to kind of see the impact and the outreach, I think that's really, really powerful. But also what I realized in conversation and through them and other people that I work with, being exposed to different worlds, is there is need and for architects and for like basically for the skill sets that we have, for the ability, for our abilities to bring to the table, because there's voices that are oftentimes missing. And I think it's just us who it's, I think more often than not, I think it's just architectural arrogance that keeps us from joining the conversation, larger conversations at hand. And I'm saying that because I find the kind of issues the world is facing right now, no single profession can solve them. And that's because we worked in these last years, right? It's all about experts and narrowing things down. And then all these things, when they happen in isolation, nobody can really address them by themselves. So I think more than anything, it's time for people to intersect and kind of get out of their expert boxes and find new perspectives. Because I feel, okay, we tried this way of pushing the world. Clearly, I think we're in a moment where, okay, it is not working. Many things are not working from many points of view, right? The income inequality between people, the technological and biotechnological revolutions are really about to also push the world in crazy places. Climate change, just to state the obvious one, they require more from us, and I think it's time. It's an amazing time actually to be alive, to be able to deal with that.